back, everybody, and we have the very final short session of the day, which I actually think is the most accessible, most interesting session, because this will put this whole debate we've had today into the bigger context. Because guess what? Everything's about politics, and everything's about geopolitics. And today we have Tom Nuttall from The Economist, who's going to moderate a very short conversation with Sean Kidney, the CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative, and Piotr Arak, the director of Polish Economic Institute. So please, welcome our speakers to the stage, and we will want to hear all you've got to say about the future of sustainability and geopolitics. Thank you.
Where would you like me, Tom?
Yeah.
I don't know. Why don't you go over there? Great. Thank you, Linda. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to moderate this discussion on a fascinating topic for which we have very, very little time, and we are going to have to stop on time because Mr. Arak has a flight to catch. It strikes me...
Everybody here has a drink to catch.
Right, there you go. It strikes me that a year ago, things were looking up for the transatlantic relationship. NATO, of course, had been reinvigorated amid the war in Ukraine. You'd had cooperation on getting a minimum corporate tax rate. And then came the Inflation Reduction Act, which seemed to take the Europeans rather by surprise. Apparently, there was very little lobbying effort on Capitol Hill for American lawmakers to think about European interests when they were putting this law together. And then you had sort of an interesting development. So first, the Europeans were spooked. Then they seemed to be angry. And then, depending on which way you look at it, they either got themselves together and came up with their own answer to some of these laws, their own subsidies, their relaxation of state aid rules, certain presidents of certain countries talking about made in Europe provisions and so on. Or if you look at it the other way around, they were undermining everything that the European Union had always stood for. And that sort of seems to be where we are right now. So in the context of sustainability and the discussions that you've had today, I thought I might start by asking our panelists, if we are getting into a world of subsidy races, with a risk of corporations playing the Europeans and the Americans off against one another to build their factories, secure their supply chains and so on, is this really the best way to allocate capital? Or are we at risk of simply misallocating it and going down a much less efficient route towards decarbonization than we might otherwise do? And Piotr, why don't you start?
Well, the obvious answer that, for example, the International Monetary Fund gives is that these kinds of measures decrease actually economic output. So if you're going to have more subsidies, we didn't have them for many years, whether it is the European Union or the United States, is going to decrease the possible of flows of trade across the Atlantic, and it, of course, is going to decrease the economic output of the two biggest economies, meaning the European Union and the United States. So, yeah, this is an issue. Then I would say why the US is doing something like that. So the reason for that, this is actually the first piece of legislation pushed by the House and a sitting US president in terms of climate policy ever. We might remember the Obama times as somehow a moment of reforms, a lot of things happening in the US, but it was all based on executive order. So it was basically changed and destroyed in legal terms when a Republican president came to power. So this is actually the first time that the US is doing something like that. So basically, if you're rooting for change in terms of climate policy, decreasing emissions, having a more greener and better future, you should be actually rooting for the US because they're doing something good.
Exactly.
This is the first time that they're actually doing anything in terms of such policies. And this is also the first time that the US has an industrial policy similar to the European one in most probably 30, 50 years. So before Ronald Reagan became a president. So it's also tells you a lot where we are in terms of industrial policy, when the pendulum of Karl Polanyi came, so in the terms of interventionism versus less interventionism or liberalism in terms of economic policy. So we're more in the interventionist kind of phase of the world. And this is what the US is doing. And I wouldn't say that they should, hear the European voice of business, because this is the voice of business in the US and also European business in the US that actually wanted to have more possibilities to prosper. And the maybe side note, which is quite frankly funny, it's the Republican states which are going to benefit the most of the policies implemented by a Democratic White House in terms of increasing FDIs, increasing investment rates, increasing jobs created, because in the first 8 months of the Inflation Reduction Act, approximately 40 new projects been started. They cost, not up till this moment, but they're going to cost about $44 billion US, and they are set to create 32,000 jobs. We don't know how many of these investments would actually be prepared by the companies. Those investments would happen without IRA. This is something you cannot do a counterfactual. Probably some of these investments would happen either way in the US. So I don't see that this is a problem. The issue is more or less, in this case, with the European Union, and we're used to be the leader in green policy, in being green. We have bikes, the US has trucks, we are green, we have vegetarian food or whatever. And we do see ourselves as being a leader in a policy element. And even in industrial policy, we weren't actually a leader, because up to this moment, without IRA, the United States actually had more green inventions, green projects that have been certified in the patent offices than the European Union per capita. So they actually been a leader without any subsidies up to this moment in terms of developing new technologies in the field that we feel we're a leader in, which is something quite interesting. And the other thing that we get wrong, the IRA is not against European interests or European business, it's against China. If you go to a room to talk about trade in the United States, the half of the room you're going to see military people. This is the moment of debate in the United States where you're going to have a general, economist at the same panel talking about trade policy of the United States, and then it's all going to be also about climate. And you're going to have somebody more green friendly than a green wearing military man. And this is the main difference between us and the United States. We don't treat trade as an element of security. They do, and they think that they have there is a threat to the economic complex of the United States caused by China, which then is also connected with the dependencies in terms of PVs and everything that we also see, but they are actually doing quite a lot to decrease this dependency. For example, building stuff that could be done cheaper, easier on the other side of the Atlantic, but then it's going to be built in the US, for security reasons, not for reasons of cost, not for the reasons of decreasing the emissions, for example, actually of the US economy. So this is the one element that we get wrong, and we cannot easily adapt. And
I'm just going to ask you very briefly, there's lots to chew on there, but just a brief follow-up question. You say that the Europeans are getting it wrong, this is about China and not Europe. I mean, fine, although lots of Europeans will point to made in America provisions, not in China. But if we wanted to think about the most efficient way to decarbonize, if we think about the manufacture of PV cells, for example, if we look at the subsidies and the tax breaks that are being poured into this space by the Americans, from a European perspective, can we not argue, well, rather than seeking to emulate this and ensure that companies don't decamp and go to America, why don't we simply take advantage of those subsidies and buy in all of that stuff from America, take advantage of the subsidies that they're pouring into their space? Wouldn't it be better to do that rather than seeking to emulate their own subsidies?
Well, yeah, the threat is that lots of the industrial people who are not in this room from Germany and France are, basically always rent-seeking in their own governments. So you have two biggest economies in the EU, and also two countries which have the highest levels of state aid after 2020 provided to their businesses, and before 2020, so before the pandemic, actually also the highest level of subsidies which were illegal in terms of the regulations, of competitive regulations of the European Union, and also legal state aid, so assistance for research and development and stuff like that. So state assistance for companies operating in Europe, it's nothing new. It's an old story. We do that. So businesses get a lot of assistance actually in the European Union. It's that in the US they didn't. That's the main difference. And they of course the businesses want to have and they're going to use this talking point that this is easier. The US is doing something which is a race to the bottom, which is basically easier in terms of what you want to do. You're going to get money if you're going to pursue something. As if the European Union is not a federal state. It doesn't have an EU-wide tax system. You cannot impose some changes which are typical for a federal government. We cannot do that. We don't even call the green taxes taxes. They're not taxes. They're kinds of some mechanisms like the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is a tariff. It's a tax, because then this is the nation state's authority. So this is how we have to maneuver, and it's going to be more complex. So the companies and corporations in the EU can easily use the example of the US because it has a different system as doing something simpler and easier. Because they don't have all this this history and all these regulations of cooperation between countries, not as a federal system.
Sean, what are your thoughts on this new world of industrial policy that we're entering?
Eisenhower in the 1950s managed to get a national highway system built. And he built it under the guise of moving tanks across the US fast if the Russians invaded.
Yeah.
You can use security issues for all sorts of things, as we are currently doing in Europe. Cheap change. He didn't really believe that the Russians are going to invade, but it worked in terms of selling it and so on. So, there's lots of things. I want to say we haven't got a shortage of capital. The efficient allocation of capital might be nice from an economic perspective, but the world does not always allocate capital efficiently, rather the reverse. It often makes stupid decisions, like the UK government did 12 years ago, 15 years ago, when it decided to build offshore wind. When the Conservative Party, its own voters, didn't like onshore wind, changed the hills. They hadn't arranged for, like the Danes did, for revenue to go to small towns and local people. And so there was a push against it. So they paid 50% more to park it out of sight offshore. Now, we all benefited, despite it being an utterly stupid, irrational decision.
We did the same,
You did the same here. And it drove down the cost of offshore wind, and now Japan's building offshore wind at a cheaper price because the UK blew money. We do that all the time. Sometimes it's fantastic what we do. The reason why we have lower renewable energy prices globally now is because the German government in 2001 instituted a feed-in tariff, and then the Chinese picked it up in 2006 with the world's biggest commissioning of solar every year since then. Last year, it was an even larger commissioning of renewable energy than ever before. And they've driven down the price by providing production volume. And their manufacturers have then exported globally. And I was speaking to a German government official a week ago, was moaning about how the Chinese had stolen their energy. And saying, well, if you'd managed to engineer European-wide offtake agreements, you would be still in the game. But you blew it because you got caught up in Indonesian national policy within Europe. We need to start thinking like a large economy. Otherwise, we're toast. And that is a challenge for Europe because it is not quite there yet. It's a bit like the US states in 1788 haven't quite gelled into a country yet. But if we're going to actually see the change that we need to have, we're going to have to operate. Now, we operate across Europe as a global economy, as a globally significant economy. Of course, on the energy system, we're kind of forced to deal with this now, right? Yep. Thanks to the war and gas, we have to build those interconnectors. We've been sitting on wind energy approvals in countries around Europe for the last 15 years. I mean, Katarina will tell you how many in Poland are stacked up that haven't been put through the system. Now thanks to having to get off Russian gas, we're forced to tackle both interconnectors and local energy generation. This is part of growing up as an economy. But I want to stress there's no shortage of capital. We have capital pouring out of our ears on this planet. In fact, this capital doesn't have enough places to go to at the moment. Even these high interest rate environments, people are nervous. Creating investments to soak up capital is in fact a high priority for us macroeconomically. And getting it out of German bunds, by the way, it's a negative interest rate still in German bunds, and putting it into places a bit of return is really what we've got to try and do. Look, what's happening? We are entering global storms. These are not going to abate, they are going to increase in intensity. Climate change, in every period in history we've seen it, has been associated with three things. It's been associated with war, famine, and pandemic. The IPCC has been predicting pandemics being a regular feature of the 21st century since 1988. War, we had one, and we're going to get more. Famines, well, I heard a speech from an FAO official a couple of days ago saying that the world has never been as vulnerable to famine as it is right now. They've never seen it like this. I was shocked at a conference I was in Paris the other day, because all around the world there are water crises, there are heat crises going on. It's not just the Ukrainian export problem. There are other things going on. Water crises are everywhere. So we can expect to see more likelihood of famine in many different places. That'll be good for Polish farmers, of course, but not so good for the rest of the world. And war, well, we do have if I remember correctly, a petrostate kleptocrat just invaded a neighbour using fossil fuel revenue from Europe to do it. Oh, it's not entirely different to the wars that might be associated with the transition we have to go through, but most of the wars are going to be around the conflict as people try and move. In a survey in Pakistan recently, 85% of young people surveyed said they wanted to leave the country because of the crisis that Pakistan's facing now. A lot of those are going to try and leave. They're starting to turn up on European shores, etc. Unless we resolve these issues, we're going to get much more difficult geopolitical, macro-political issues going forward, much more difficult. We have seen nothing in the Syrian crisis of a few years ago, which, by the way, was rooted in climate change. The collapse of agriculture in Syria in 2008, forcing 3 million people off the land into the cities, and then the collapse of agriculture in Russia in 2010, thanks to climate change, which quadrupled the price of wheat in Syria and led to riots. So we've already seen climate change wars, folks. Think of these as becoming the new norm. How we operate in a world where these start becoming the norm is now a particularly serious issue. I'm going to say in terms of national policy, the IRA is fantastic. It's forced us in Europe to try and get our act together. But the good news is in Europe, we have a lot of subsidies already. The IRA is a blunt instrument. There is no doubt that there are all sorts of companies. We had a session at CERAWeek in Houston a few weeks ago where the Houston finance sector is now saying it's going to be the energy transition sector for the US because there is so much tax credit money coming through. Yeah. Fantastic, that's what I want. I want Exxon to decide to get involved in direct air capture and to bury it underground because it's going to make a lot of money out of it. I'm not expecting us to be able to make the change fast enough otherwise. In Europe, we actually have a lot of subsidies. We don't package them. There's two things we do badly in Europe at the moment. We don't sell what it is we're doing in a way that the industry can understand, including certainty, and we caught ourselves up in paperwork and complexity. Look at the taxonomy that I'm involved in. Oh, it's not exactly simple, is it? It should be simple. We have a brief at the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance this year to simplify the taxonomy for everyone, make it easier for everyone. This is essential. In every area of green especially, We've got to make things move faster, and that includes, by the way, planning, permitting for wind energy in Poland or the energy vendor in Germany. All of these things are things we can do without too much difficulty. I'm going to say IRA is fantastic because of the way it's galvanized money, galvanized energy. After it came in, I was in a conference in Indonesia. I sat down to this guy. What are you doing? Oh, I'm building the world's largest green energy plant, green hydrogen plant in Kansas. I thought that was Sinopec in Inner Mongolia. No, out of the blue, they've managed to generate this huge plant which will make money before it ships a kilo of hydrogen because the tax credits. I don't care. I just wanted to build it because I know we can make the demand work. Anything that gets it going. And right now, things are so serious, so dire going forward. Looking at, if you ask any climate scientists and get them to tell you what they think is going to happen, it's a very grim story that we need these kind of blunt instruments all over the place. And we're getting them from the US. In China, in Europe, I want our instruments to look blunt soon, look simple, look easy. And in China, there's a wrestle going on, there's a fight going on between the centre that has deployed some blunt instruments and the provinces that are saying, hang on, we understand fossil fuels. So we've got work to do. But just think, if we could get the three economies, the three big economies of the planet, treating Europe as an economy, the US and China vying with blunt instruments to see how could they transform their economies fast, we'd have a chance.
But let's just take the IRA, let's sort of take your premises, accept your premises, and then look at the way that the IRA functions. It's, you know, the lawmaking machine is a Bismarck sausage-making machine. You peer inside, and it's not very pretty. And everybody was able to see how that piece of signature legislation emerged, and the role that certain pivotal senators were able to play, and so on. Do we trust a system like that? And then the bureaucrats who are trying to identify those sectors that are going to be most helpful in advancing decarbonization to do their job properly. Are they able to predict the future course of technology? Are they able to think about those sectors which public money ought to be pouring into? Because we seem rather to have moved away. Very often in this discussion, we forget that the EU built some time ago the world's, what I think remains the world's largest carbon market. And you before were saying that in Obama's time, he had to resort to executive actions because he couldn't get anything through Congress. The signature example, presumably being the attempt to create a cap and trade market in the US. Those discussions appear to have disappeared, as far as I can see. Is that something we ought to worry about?
I mean, in a way you refer to the taxonomy. That's not what the taxonomy does. The taxonomy says broad guidelines, what you've got to do, which are absolutely technology agnostic. There's enormous room for innovation. But we need to have clarity about what we've got to do. I mean, for example, do you have any idea what a reasonable amount of energy efficiency improvement on your house should be to make sure it's future fit? I'll bet you've got no damned idea. Frankly, I don't either. Peter Sweetman does in the front row. We need those kinds of rules socialised across Europe, for example, as part of guidance, and then linked to incentives. So if I do get a retrofit on my house to get to a certain level, hey, I might get a 1% cheaper home loan. That would be good, Peter, wouldn't it? These are the sort of things that we can do with the kind of guidance we're bringing in around taxonomies. There's nothing in the taxonomy that says only triple glazed windows count. It's much more broader than that. So in fact, I think what we've been doing at a bureaucratic level on the guidance, at its principle, is good. We've just shrouded it in more complexity. We've got to strip away the complexity around it so we can get back to the heart of it. But the essence of it is right. It's not about picking a manufacturer in France, the old-fashioned French way of doing it, which I appreciate you're raising as a problem. And that's what the US is doing. Under the IRA, it's effectively saying certain kinds of areas of work, like something that drastically reduces carbon, direct air capture, is in. If you're going to do that, here are some rules, but if you can find a more efficient way, go for it. And that's technology agnostic to that extent.
Well, the importance of what IRA has is the flexibility of the regulator. So first off, it's when do you actually spend the money and when do you have to do the reporting to the government. So it actually is about 10 years. So you know that companies are going to probably work with the American government in order to have a longer period of time of reporting the data of what they actually did and then actually receiving breaks or money as state assistance. So this is one of the important elements. But any macroeconomist is going to say you that picking and choosing winners is basically the idea of any centrally planned economy, which doesn't work. So it didn't work. It doesn't work on paper. It always decreases the economic output that could be created. So the potential output. What works is the smart diversification. So we have in Europe the smart specializations kind of idea. But what actually works is if you have a more diverse base of production, energy source, anything else, it's better. It's thinking it that way. So I don't see this big threat actually in the taxonomy or in the energy mixes or policies implemented by the member states. Maybe the clarity about some of them. This is the problematic matter that we could see. But I don't see, and if European Union or the European Commission tries to choose basically a technology which is better, then they're going to find a lobby that actually thinks otherwise, and they're going to have to fight them on that matter. I think Brussels is, the lobbying structure is quite strong on that.
Let's turn back to China, which you mentioned in your remarks. On a sort of superficial level, the rhetoric that you hear coming from the EU and the US appears to be converging. The buzzword in town in Brussels is de-risking rather than decoupling. And the Eurocrats will tell you with joy that this is a word that you now hear emanating from the lips of Jake Sullivan as well. But the question is, do the Europeans and the Americans mean the same thing by de-risking?
Well, of course, no. If you're going to see a plane full of German business people flying in with Chancellor Scholz to Beijing, or the same stuff happening with a royal visit of Emmanuel Macron, of course, it's not the same. So of course, for Germany being the biggest export economy in the world, de-risking or decoupling from the Chinese economy is a non-option. It basically means destruction of a big chunk of the economy. It's not like with the commodities coming from Russia, which are somehow easier to substitute. There you have a market that actually needs to, who buys the products that you are producing. So without the Russian market, we can do without in terms of purchasing power or the cars that they've been buying or not buying actually in the last couple of years due to the shortage of microchips. So I would say that this is a whole different issue, and talking with experts from the United States, both from Homeland and from the other parts of the American government, you get a feeling that the basic scenario is what's going to happen if you're going to have a maritime blockade of mainland China because of some military threat to Taiwan. And yeah, we don't talk about competitiveness and policies in terms of trade the same way. We don't see it as a risk. We don't treat a war or an invasion of Taiwan as a viable option that China is going to pursue, and the repercussions of that to international trade. One of the most interesting parts of analysis conducted by security analysts in Germany and in Paris is the element of secondary sanctions. So we don't act in a situation like that because we don't have to. So the US blockades China. There is difficulties in terms of produce that we have on our market, but then we still operate as a business in China, investing, doing whatever, as some companies wanted or did pursue the same policy in Russia, so being still present in Russia. And what we see as a problem in that circumstance is the secondary sanctions. So what then if the US does with China the same as they did with Iran? So basically banning all businesses in operating in the United States of America if they do business in China. I don't want to know what this would mean to international trade, but given the circumstance that we're here in Prague, you have refugees from war-torn Ukraine. You have authoritarian power it has never seen before in Chinese leadership since Mao. You need to think about the possible consequences, not to, be wishfully thinking that, okay, it's not going to happen because I'm not preparing for that, as you did with the Russian example and energy policy of some member states of the European Union. We need to prepare. We need to think as a viable scenario in Europe as well, and whatever the repercussions for the US is going to be, and then for us as well. And the US, with its international trade, can force us to comply. Still, they have enough power to do that.
Yeah, and there will be many voices saying that after everything that they've done to help Europe during this war, they might expect a little bit of reciprocity when it comes to China and Taiwan. Sean, can I ask you a sort of tangentially related question, which is, in this sort of triptych that is supposed to govern Europe's policy towards China, a partner in some areas, a competitor in others, and then a systemic rival in other ways, the area in which we're most often told that we need China as a strategic partner is in climate. To the extent that the sort of geopolitical tussle between the Americans and the Chinese is warming up, and the Europeans get caught in the crossfire, will it become increasingly difficult to maintain that sort of relationship with the Chinese, to work with them on climate? And if it does, how much does it matter?
Well, John Kerry's found it difficult over the last year, when at one stage he had a summit booked in Beijing with his counterpart, and he turned up at the airport and it was all cancelled. So clearly, it's challenging. But I still think that keeping green cooperation going between the three major economies, with a question mark about how we do it with India, given the India-China tensions as well, is a viable option. And I know in China, they're willing to talk about that, especially with Europe, because Europe is seen as not quite as hostile as the US. And at the moment, because the geopolitical hostility between the US and China has clearly got extremes, I find it a bit frightening in China, the extent to which what I call forces of nationalism are allowed. But equally, I find it terrifying in the US. Hey,
he's got to catch a flight.
I didn't mean to upset you like that, sorry.
You scared him off.
So it is challenging. In the US at the moment, there is a terribly febrile atmosphere around China. I heard a speech by Nikki Haley, presidential candidate, recently, as on the soft side of the Republicans, in Singapore of all places, where it didn't really go down very well, which can only call beating the drums of war. So as much as we might worry about China invading Taiwan, which I do worry about it, and I thought if Putin had been successful in Ukraine, that was likely to be a next step. Thank God the Ukrainians have fought back so savagely and bravely. But at the same time, the increased warlikeness of the European stance just increases the risk of a mistake, as we all know from past years. We came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis because both sides were just so jittery about it. So these are clearly substantial risks for us. In Europe, we don't want a war. We've been forced to a war. We need to ensure we can survive war going forward. There's a different security agenda going forward in Europe, but equally we have a bit of an understanding of how to try and broker peace between warring nation states. We've done a bit of that in the last 20 years, and we need to take that story global to try and dampen these hostilities. And I'm acutely aware that in a febrile atmosphere, complaints become magnified, especially by the Tucker Carlsons of the world and the Global Times in Beijing. And things get polarized, and we've seen how difficult polarization within the US can make any kind of sensible policy. And now we're seeing this geopolitically. So I think it's really worrying. I think from a European perspective, there's actually a lot that we're including, by the way, on the news side. In a global world where people are consuming a lot of European news, we've got a responsibility to make sure that there's information out there in those economies that is vaguely rational, rather than the crazy environment, the Fox on one side, the Global Times on the other. There's a bunch of things we can do in Europe to try and create an enabling environment for geopolitical coexistence.
Let me just, our time's about to run out, but if I can just ask you the question that Piotr kind of left dangling, which is, what is the plan B for Europe, or maybe more specifically, is there a hedging strategy if things really do start to get very nasty between the US and China, if we start talking about secondary sanctions and so on? What is the European plan B? We've already seen the Dutch agree to block exports of semiconductors, going along with the American strategy. If that's the world that we're entering, are we in Europe thinking hard enough about what our strategy is going to be?
We're very intertwined with the Chinese economy, particularly in Germany.
Yeah.
Extraction and separation is not a viable proposition in my lifetime. So we are, in a way, thank goodness, dependent on peace. We've got a visceral need to ensure that peace is retained. The US is probably in that position too, except that it has much more in the way of lunatic elements. Think of it as Marine Le Pen in power, which makes things a bit scarier in terms of how they might jump. You know, if Donald Trump were to get elected, it all gets a bit scary there. Are we thinking creatively about what to do from a European perspective? No, we're not thinking creatively enough. We've been very inward looking for a long time. Yeah. European foreign policy can only be called nascent. DG INPA is not exactly a behemoth on the planet, you know, and there's constantly a fight between the French, the Germans, and Brussels in terms of who's got to look at what happened to Ursula von der Leyen in China recently. Yeah. We do need to get our act together, and I'd hoped that the Russian-Ukrainian invasion might force us there, but as you can see, it's going slowly, right? So we're going to need to get countries that have a particularly urgent view about the need to get our act together as Europe, such as Czechia, such as Poland, to push this envelope, push this story within Europe. We do luckily have a way of getting new forces to play to drive it. Over the next few years, it's critically important that we grow a European presence in a number of ways. One is that we have a closer integration between our regional foreign policy and our trade policy. The CBAM is a sort of step in that direction, which is why we've got a beautiful element, which is the Commission is saying to other countries, you collect the carbon tax, we don't care about collecting the carbon tax as long as it's collected. So they now have 3 countries they're negotiating with to set up carbon tax collection regimes, which will be money for those treasuries. Oh, it's beautiful. But instituting global carbon tax. These are things we can do from our experience of managing 27 countries, so on. So I do think we've got to have a better foreign policy. We do need to have a defence policy that's forced upon us now. We do need to have a trade policy. We're sort of getting there. And we need to have an engagement policy. We've had a stuttering approach to countering the Belt and Road and so on in the last few years. But the truth is we have a lot of companies that are actually often more trusted in many countries. Look at the decision in Ethiopia to award railway contracts to European contractors rather than Chinese contractors on the basis they thought they would do a better job and charge less interest going forward. We have some soft power we can deploy. And we need to deploy it in Africa and in ASEAN, that is caught betwixt the powers, and in South Asia, which is the rising economy. You know, clearly India will be the equal of China and the US and Europe over the next 30 years. Let's make those relationships work now and build them. And you know, we kind of understand how bad war can be. It's a long time ago, but we've got a lot of monuments that remind us, a lot of histories, and that above all is what we have to work towards, because the risk of that is increased enormously.
Well, thank you. We're out of time. We moved a bit away from sustainability, but I think one of the things that this...
That's sustainability.
Well, I think one of the things that this conversation demonstrated is that it's, these things are rather difficult to disentangle from one another once you start thinking about them. So thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much, in absentia, Piotr, who hopefully will catch his flight on time. And thanks very much to the audience.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely excellent. So now we have drinks just outside, and I think maybe you can try and meet, again, somebody you maybe haven't met yet. We have Peter Sweetman, who has just landed from Madrid as well. So he's in the room, so try and figure out who's he. And yeah, Thank you. So, and do discuss what happened today. What was the most interesting things that you heard? And also, what were the most interesting people you met? And we'll meet again tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you.